The desert wind swept in like a sigh from the bones of forgotten things, as Clint Eastwood rode into the brittle edge of Redemption Bluff, a town hanging on by splinters and superstition. The sky overhead was a cracked bowl of copper and blood, sun dipping low like a tired eye unwilling to witness what would come. Clint's silhouette was hard and lean in the dying light, a specter stitched from leather and dust, the saddle creaking beneath him like an old wound retelling itself. His horse, a gray Mustang named Grace, moved slowly as if she, too, sensed the weight he carried. Redemption Bluff was a place lost to time, where buildings slouched like drunks and silence outlasted ambition. A crooked saloon sign danced faintly in the wind, the letters Lone Dove barely holding on to the wood. Clint tied Grace loosely to the hitching post, his hands slow but precise, the ritual unchanged despite the years behind him. Every step he took into town was shadowed by memory, and none of them were kind. He had come not for trouble, but for something far more elusive, truth, maybe, or peace, though he hardly believed in either anymore. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with stale smoke and resignation. A piano gathered dust in the corner like an unused promise. The barkeep, a rail-thin man with eyes like split flint, paused mid-polish when he saw Clint and stiffened. The few patrons glanced his way, curiosity flickering like matchlight, then returned to their cards and drinks. Clint walked to the far corner and took a seat with his back to the wall, ordering a rye with a nod. He didn't need to talk. The weight of his presence did enough. As he sipped the whiskey, rough and forgettable, he unfolded a letter from his coat, its corners softened by time, its ink smudged but still legible. It read, "Come if you still believe in us." Signed with a single name, Eliza. That name clawed through his chest like a thorn vine every time he read it. Eliza, the woman he'd almost given up his guns for, had vanished 5 years earlier after a fight neither of them truly won. Rumors drifted like ghosts. One said she ran off with a preacher's son. Another said she joined a traveling show. Clint believed none of it. He believed she was still out there, waiting. He didn't know what he expected to find here, only that something in the letter, in the scrawl and scent of it, felt real. That hope, fragile and irrational, had dragged him through desert storms and hollow towns. And just as he began to think it was another dead end, the saloon doors creaked open behind him. Every head turned. A hush fell like a veil. A woman stood there, barefoot, in a wedding dress torn and streaked with dust, dried roses clenched in one hand like a bouquet of bruises. Her eyes were wide and pale, lost in some distant place only she could see. No one claimed her. No one moved to help. Someone whispered, "She's been waiting," and another added, 3 days now. No name, just waits. Clint rose slowly, like a man approaching a ghost he half recognized. She looked at him, not startled, not afraid, but expectant, as if she'd known he would come. Her lips trembled, but no words passed. Clint stood before her, unsure what he was seeing, grief or madness or something stranger. He asked her name. She said nothing. He offered her his arm, and after a moment, she took it. Her hand was cold, yet firm, and together they stepped back into the twilight as murmurs trailed behind them like smoke. He asked where she lived, and a woman outside the general store pointed toward an old chapel just past the edge of town. "She waits there," the woman said, like a bride caught between days. The chapel was a ruin, bones of wood and forgotten hymns, its steeple cracked and tilting like a condemned man. Inside, the pews sagged beneath cobwebs and bird droppings, and stained glass flickered like bruised jewels in the dying light. The bride sat without being asked, hands folded over her bouquet, her eyes fixed on the altar as if someone were still standing there waiting to marry her. Clint sat beside her, close but not touching, and told her about Eliza, about the letter, about chasing hope down 100 false roads. Her expression didn't change, but a tear tracked silently down her cheek, catching the light like a whisper of truth. Clint didn't ask why she wore the dress, or whom she was waiting for. He didn't need answers. He only knew that silence can sometimes say more than stories. He told her about his dreams, foolish ones, like a quiet house near water, mornings with black coffee, and silence not born of loneliness but of peace. Her head tilted slightly, a subtle gesture that felt like understanding. When he finally said, "Maybe you and I are both leftovers in a world that's moved on," she blinked slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of that truth. Night came fast in Redemption Bluff, and as the moon rose like a silver wound, Clint turned toward her and asked if she'd marry him. Not for love, he said, not yet, but for not being alone anymore. She nodded once, just once, and it felt like enough. They returned to town at dawn, his arm around her shoulders as if shielding her from whatever had kept her here so long. He knocked on the sheriff's door, who stared at them like a man caught between a dream and a riddle. The sheriff summoned the preacher, who arrived in boots that didn't match and whiskey still clinging to his breath. Word spread like wildfire, and by noon the whole town had gathered near the chapel, drawn by curiosity, disbelief, or the rarest of all reasons, hope. Clint stood tall in a suit someone loaned him, his hat pressed to his chest, while the bride wore the same tattered dress, the dried bouquet renewed with a few fresh daisies someone had picked from behind the saloon. The preacher stammered through the vows, forgetting half and inventing the rest, but no one cared. When he asked if they took each other, Clint said, "I do," without flinching. The bride said nothing, but she stepped forward and kissed him, slow and deliberate, and for a moment, everything in the world paused. Afterward, they walked hand in hand through the main street, townsfolk parting around them in reverent silence. Children peeked from windows, and old women crossed themselves. Someone began to hum a wedding tune, slow and off-key, and others joined until it became a song of sorts. Clinton looked back. He had no need to. In marrying the woman no one claimed, he had claimed something larger than love. He had claimed a reason to keep living. Whatever haunted her, whatever story her silence carried, it no longer mattered. They were two ghosts in a town that barely existed, and yet somehow they had found each other before nightfall. The morning after the wedding, Redemption Bluff woke up differently, as if the wind had shifted just enough to carry something new, or something very old, into the bones of the town. Clint Eastwood stood on the front porch of the small cabin behind the chapel, coffee steaming in his tin cup, his eyes tracking the outline of the woman he now called his wife as she wandered barefoot through the dusty grass, still wearing the hem of that torn wedding dress like it was armor. She hadn't spoken a word since the ceremony, but her silence felt less like absence now, and more like waiting, like something important was trying to remember how to breathe inside her. Clint wasn't one for superstition, but the air had gone dense, like the moments before a storm that doesn't break. He remembered the way the townsfolk had stared at her, not just with curiosity, but with a kind of restrained fear, like people trying not to disturb sleeping curse. That unease gnawed at Clint more than he cared to admit. Later that day, he walked into the general store to get supplies and found the shopkeeper, Marnie Thistle, watching him the way a cat watches a snake. She rang up his goods slowly, then said, "She looks like her." When Clint asked who, Marnie glanced around the empty shop and whispered, "Clara Bell, sheriff's daughter. Vanished on her wedding day 3 years back. Never found her." Clint froze, the name unfamiliar but unsettling. Marnie continued, "Walked out in a dress, just like that one. Folks said she got cold feet and ran, but she trailed off and didn't finish the thought." Clint pressed further, but she only shook her head and muttered something about curses don't break easy. That night, he returned home to find his wife sitting by the window, eyes fixed on the chapel. He asked her directly, "Are you Clara Bell?" And for the first time since they met, her expression broke. Her hand trembled. She didn't speak, but she didn't deny it. The next few days passed with a strange rhythm, as if time bent slightly around them. The town watched with wary eyes. Children whispered about the ghost bride, and men at the saloon made quiet bets on how long Clint would stay. Clint noticed the old preacher, Reverend Mooney, crossing himself more often, glancing toward the chapel as if expecting it to crumble into ash. Then the dreams began, violent, disjointed dreams where Clint saw flashes of water, a broken necklace, a scream echoing off canyon walls. He'd wake up sweating, and always, she'd be there beside him, wide awake, staring into the dark. One night, she reached out and touched his chest, tracing a circle above his heart with a single finger. It felt like a warning. He started asking around, subtle questions to townsfolk who wanted nothing to do with answers. But a story began to form, ragged and whispered. Clara Bell had been engaged to a man named Jeb Trask, a brutal cattle baron with a penchant for violence and a temper soaked in whiskey. Jeb had ridden into Redemption Bluff with money and blood on his boots, claimed Clara like a trophy, and swore the town in his silence when she disappeared. No one had seen her since, and no one dared speak her name, until the day Clint's bride walked in wearing that same torn dress. Clint now suspected the letter he received had never been written by Eliza at all. He held the paper up one night, compared the handwriting to a dusty page from the church's marriage registry, and the truth hit him like a fist. The signature matched Clara Bell's. Someone, or something, had drawn him here. Whether it was fate, guilt, or something more ghostly, Clint didn't know. But he felt caught in something older than justice, deeper than grief. The bride began walking at night, always toward the riverbank, just outside of town. Clint followed once and saw her kneel by the water, eyes scanning the current as if it might return something lost. She placed a rose in the river and whispered, not aloud, but in a way that carried through the air like a prayer. By the end of the week, Clint could no longer pretend the town wasn't hiding something. He confronted the sheriff, a gaunt man named Avery Bell, Clara's father. Avery's hands shook as Clint slammed the letter down on his desk. "Is this your daughter?" Clint asked. Avery stared at the paper, then at Clint, and finally admitted through gritted teeth that Clara had been meant to marry Jeb, but she'd gone missing the night before the ceremony. Jeb claimed she ran, but Avery always suspected foul play. He had no proof, only the rumors of a scream heard near Dead Horse Ravine. When Clint pressed why he never investigated, Avery snapped, "Because Jeb owned this town, and I didn't want to bury another daughter beside her mother." It was a coward's answer, but it felt like truth. Clint left the office with a storm in his veins. He returned to the cabin and found his bride waiting with a box, an old jewelry box he'd never seen before. Inside it was a wedding ring etched with the initials CB plus JT. The initials turned his blood cold. The ring must have belonged to Jeb. When Clint asked where she found it, she touched her temple, then her chest, then pointed to the chapel. He understood. It had come from a memory buried so deep it had taken a near marriage to drag it to the surface. That night, he lit a fire and stared into it, thinking about Eliza, about Clara, and about how sometimes a man doesn't find closure. Sometimes closure finds him. The bride sat beside him, closer now than before, and for the first time, she laid her head on his shoulder. It felt like trust. It felt like the beginning of something fragile. He said softly, "We have to finish this." And though she still didn't speak, she nodded. They visited the ravine at dawn, Clint riding beside her in silence, the sky bruised with the memory of night. At the edge of the gorge, Clint found what he hadn't known he was looking for: scraps of white lace tangled in the thorns, half-buried bones at the cliff's base, a rusted locket with a cracked photo of Clara as a child. The bride stared down the steep path and wept, soundless and unfiltered, her hands trembling as she dropped the ring into the chasm. The air shifted, birds scattered. Clint felt the weight lift like a fog burning off at daybreak. They rode back into town with no fanfare, but the townspeople watched them with quiet reverence, as if sensing that something unsaid had finally been spoken. That night, Clint returned to the saloon, took the same seat in the corner, and sipped a rye with a steadier hand. The barkeep poured it without question and set a second glass beside it. When Clint asked why, the man said, "For the lady." Clint smiled faintly. The bride hadn't spoken, but she'd begun humming, soft little melodies from somewhere deep in her soul. She'd taken up tending flowers outside the chapel. The children no longer whispered, they waved. And Clint, for the first time in years, began to sleep without waking from nightmares. Redemption Bluff, it seemed, had buried a secret and been haunted by it. And only by claiming her, by marrying the ghost no one dared name, Had Clint unearthed what needed to be set free? Clint Eastwood stood outside the chapel as dawn painted the town in brittle gold, the desert wind curling around him like the last breath of an old story refusing to die. The bride, Clara, though she still hadn't spoken her name, tended to her small flower garden beneath the crumbling stained glass, her hands covered in soil and grace. The daisies had taken to blooming early, perhaps sensing the shift in the air, or maybe honoring the silence that now lived between them, not as absence, but as understanding. A week had passed since they found the bones in the ravine, and though the sheriff had quietly confirmed Clara's death in the town ledger, he hadn't dared arrest Clint or question the marriage. There was a collective hush about it now, like the town had exhaled a secret it had carried too long. But Clint knew something unfinished lingered. Clara still walked in her sleep, still whispered strange fragments in the darkness, still stared into mirrors as if trying to remember who she had once been. One morning, Clint found her kneeling at the edge of their bed, cradling a small leather-bound journal to her chest. She handed it to him without a word. Inside were entries written in delicate script, memories of a girl growing up in Redemption Bluff, of sneaking through wheat fields, of drawing wedding dresses in the dirt with a stick. Then the tone shifted. The later entries were panicked, broken, filled with dread. Mentions of Jeb grew frequent. His drinking, his fists, his threats. One entry, dated just days before her wedding, read, "He says if I run, he'll find me. If I stay, I'll vanish anyway." Clint closed the journal with a trembling hand. This was not just a ghost story. It was a record of betrayal, of a young woman erased by silence, remembered only because she refused to stay gone. That night, Clint sat by the fire and read every word aloud, his voice low and steady, giving shape to the life Clara had lost. When he finished, she reached for his hand and held it to her chest, and for the first time, he felt her heartbeat, fast, uncertain, human. The next day, Reverend Mooney arrived at the cabin with a parcel. Inside was Clara's original wedding veil, yellowed with age and stitched with tiny pearls. "I found it tucked behind the altar," he said, looking down. "I think she left it behind on purpose." Clara took the veil with trembling fingers and pressed it to her face, tears soaking into the lace. Clint saw then that grief wasn't the only thing she was made of. There was defiance in her, too, a kind of quiet fire that had kept her from fading entirely. "She didn't die all the way," the Reverend muttered. "Somehow she stayed." Clint nodded because that was the truth. Some part of Clara had waited, unburied by the town's denial, clinging to the world through longing and unfinished vows. But now she was here, still mute, still wounded, but undeniably alive. And so Clint did what he always did when the world didn't make sense. He rode. He rode to the Trask Ranch, or what remained of it, just a burned-out foundation and a rusted gate choking on weeds. The place had collapsed after Jeb's death, or disappearance, depending on who you asked. Clint walked the perimeter, boots crunching on brittle wood, and found a cellar door half buried under stone and dust. Inside was a trunk sealed tight with rope. He broke it open. Inside were Clara's old things, a child's doll, a blue ribbon, a mirror with her name etched into the handle. And one other thing, a letter addressed to "My dearest C." It was from Jeb. His words were desperate, slurred, manic. "I couldn't let you go. You were the only thing that ever made the world quiet. I didn't mean to push you. You weren't supposed to fall." Clint gritted his teeth, the horror of it coiling like barbed wire in his chest. So Jeb had killed her, not out of rage, but fear. Not with a gun, but with desperation. Clint took the letter and rode straight to Sheriff Bell. He slammed it down on the desk. "This is what you buried," Clint said. "You let your fear of one man bury your own daughter." Avery Bell didn't deny it. He wept, quietly, bitterly. "I saw her everywhere," the sheriff whispered. "In every mirror, every window. I thought I was cursed." Clint leaned forward. "You weren't cursed. You were guilty." And then, because there was nothing else to say, Clint walked out and left the man to his regret. That evening, Clara sat outside under a sky bruised violet, the veil now wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. Clint approached, slower this time, as if afraid to shatter something sacred. "He wrote you a letter," Clint said gently, and placed it in her lap. She didn't open it. She only nodded, then reached for Clint's face with both hands, tracing the lines around his eyes, his jaw. She studied him as if seeing a man for the first time. Not a gunslinger, not a ghost chaser, but someone who had chosen her. After everything. Even now. That night, for the first time, Clara spoke. It came out hoarse, trembling, like stone being shaped into music. "Thank you," she said. Just 2 words, but they shattered something inside Clint he hadn't known was still breakable. He pulled her into his arms, and for a moment, they were neither haunted nor haunted, just 2 people beneath the stars, trying to believe in tomorrow. After that, the town changed. Not overnight, but slowly. The preacher repaired the chapel window. Marnie Thistle started selling ribbon again. The sheriff resigned and left town, his badge pinned to the chapel door with a nail and a note that read, "Ask for forgiveness, not mine." Clara took to writing again, not journals this time, but letters to her mother, to herself, to the girl she had once been. And Clint? He stayed. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time, he had someone to stay for. A year passed, and the town learned to smile at the sound of her name. Clarabelle Eastwood. People came from nearby towns to hear the story. How a ghost bride found her voice. How a gunslinger married her before nightfall. How 2 broken people stitched a life together from the ashes of forgetting. And though some called it legend, Clint knew better. She still wore the veil on their anniversary, not as a symbol of sorrow, but of survival. They kept the chapel open, even held weddings for others there. And every so often, Clint would find Clara sitting in the front pew, eyes closed, humming the melody of a life once stolen and now reclaimed. Sometimes he joined her, fingers interlocked with hers, the silence between them rich and full. People often asked Clint why he stayed, why the man who once wandered never left. He'd smile faintly and say, because sometimes the end of the road is really the beginning. And when they pressed him, curious about whether she'd ever fully come back, whether she was ghost or girl or something in between, he'd say only this: "She came back enough to love me, and I came far enough to love her." And in the end, maybe that was all the truth ever needed to be.